So I'm Heiwai Tang, who's the director of the Asia Global Institute. And so you see, this is a new setting. Usually when we have seminars or book talks, it would be a speaker, the author of the book, standing in front of you in a lecture setting, and then talk for like 40, 50 minutes. But in this situation, because we have this edited book, Brian, Wong, and I are editors of this book, which took almost a year for us to get all the papers together and for Hong Kong U Press to publish. And since it's an edited book with contributors from all around the world, I think this is probably a better idea to have all of you to contribute to a going to be very vibrant discussion about BRICS Plus or anything related to the global economy or the geopolitical landscape. So what I'm going to do is to give a very brief introduction about what's going on for BRICS, and then I'm going to turn it to Brian, and he's going to say whatever he likes. And then we're going to go around this table with experts from different regions, and then obviously a long Q&A, probably longer Q&A than usual for any of you to contribute and to ask questions. And I don't promise that I will be able to have all the answers. Whatever question that I cannot answer, I will turn it to Brian. So that's the division of labor. So as some of you may know, I'm an economist, so I only know how to talk about the economy with figures. So I prepared some figures just like literally 7 minutes before this event. So let me just tell you the origin of BRICS. As some of you may know, is some imagined coalition or alliance between 4 countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, by Jim O'Neill, who is an economist at Goldman Sachs. I guess his own idea, and there was a time when China is about to join the WTO, and then he said, well, let's do some macroeconomic predictions about what would happen to these 4 countries. And notice that that S is a lowercase s, right? So at that time, South Africa is not part of this 5-country, loose alliance. And then he said, well, the go-to model is a so-called Solow growth model. You look at inputs like capital and labor with some predicted productivity growth, then you should be able to guess in 25 years, in 50 years, how big these 4 economies are, and more importantly, how important they are in terms of driving the global economy. So let's look at the numbers, right? In 2020, according to the report in 2001, they said these 4 countries are going to contribute around 28% of the global GDP. By 2030, they said it's going to be close to 40%. Very optimistic predictions, right? But you shouldn't blame Jim O'Neill, right? Because there was a time when the world was so peaceful. The relationship between the US and China was so great. China just joined the WTO with already over 10% economic growth per year for the preceding 4 years. And that's, everyone is so happy about, the new liberal order led by, obviously, the US. So let's look at the actual situation. That's the number that I just got from the World Bank last night. And by 2024, now you have 5 countries, including South Africa. The overall contribution of the 4 economies to the global economy is only around 25%, right? Still far away from 40% as predicted by Jim O'Neill, and still actually lower than 29% as they argued in the original report in 2001. So, not only about the global GDP, right? We have to look at actually the composition. To be honest, no bias, is all China, right? These 5 economies all added up together, 25%, but it's like 16, 17% from China, with the remaining 8% from the other 4 economies. But they are highly connected, especially for Russia. So if you look at intra-BRICS share of each country's imports within this 5-country group, so they are importing a lot more and increasingly more from the other 4 members, especially Russia since 2021 for obvious reasons. Russia now imported around 55% of stuff from the other 4 economies in this group. How about export? Same. China, by the way, is the lower line, the lower red dashed line, because China is so big and China has a lot of trade partners, and over 100 countries in the world had China as the most important importing source. So it's not surprising that the growth rate for China in terms of the export share to the other 4 economies in the BRICS group is not as stellar as the other 4 economies in BRICS. But what I'm trying to say is, China is really a connector for these 5 economies because it is a major manufacturing powerhouse, importing trade partner, as well as the most important driver for the overall contribution in the global economy. Of course, now we are talking about BRICS Plus with altogether 10 countries. Brian, remind me if I get anything wrong, is Ethiopia, Indonesia, UAE, Egypt. I'm missing one.
And Iran.
And Iran, yes, sorry. Such an important country. So there are 10 countries in BRICS Plus, and there are all the other potential candidates for the future BRICS Plus, including potentially Saudi Arabia, including potentially Malaysia as well. Yeah. So the question is, what's the future of BRICS Plus? And my short answer is I would like to learn from you, and also from all the contributors from this book, and that's the reason for why we organized a conference on BRICS Plus last year around the same time, and then 1 year later we have this very little book contributed by 15 scholars. Some of them are economists and obviously my good friends. Some of them are historians, geopolitical experts, Brian Wong's good friends. So therefore we have this very balanced view from the US, from Southeast Asia, from the Middle East, from Africa, to talk about the future of BRICS Plus, and obviously how the world is going to be shaped by the changing geopolitical landscape, especially with Trump 2.0 strategies. All right, so now to you, Brian. Anything that you would like to add?
Thanks. Thank you very much, Heiwai. And just to double check, can you guys hear me? Yes. So if I'm not audible, please do raise an objection or your hand, or point of order. Great. Thank you to all of you for being here. It really means a lot to the both of us. I can't say I speak on behalf of BRICS, but certainly for the both of us, it means a lot to have you here. And for AGI and the Hong Kong U Press, with which we were very privileged and pleased to be able to work with on this very project. I'm going to talk about 4 things in my brief remarks today. And the first is really just a macro sort of scoping and an outline of the world as we see it. And the second is an observation about what BRICS is unto itself, from a geopolitical lens and point of view. The third is the challenges and the problems that confront BRICS. And the fourth is on a role of Hong Kong. So that's the roadmap. And in case I fail to deliver on any of these, very much like a policy platform or address, you can hold me accountable, at least in most countries. Okay, so first, let's talk about the world order as we see it. A very famous theorist, sociologist, IR theorist, scholar, and I'm going to leave it up to you to guess whom I'm talking about here, once made the following quip. The old world is dying. The new world is yet to be born. We live in the age of monsters. No points for guessing who said this, but it's certainly true that the old world order, that is a sort of post-Cold War, US-led, US almost benign or quasi-benign hegemonic world order as we knew it from 1991 all the way through till, say, 2021, that those 30 years basically demarcated a world order that is rapidly unraveling before our eyes today. Whether it be in a form of growing military isolationism and a reluctance to actually support or back so-called alliance arrangements and partnerships abroad that we see from Trump, but also many of his supporters and base that in our view would outlast Trump himself. Alternatively, the weaponization, arguably excessive weaponization of the US dollar, which has culminated, of course, in many countries shifting away or seeking to shift away from the US dollar, even though the US dollar remains still till this very day by far the dominant reserve currency and also transactional currency in the world. But we're seeing the rise of cryptocurrencies, of alternative assets, of to some extent the euro, the Japanese yen, the pound sterling, and of course other currencies. And notably, you might ask me, why not RMB? And the honest truth there is digital RMB, offshore RMB has a very, 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 very long way to go before it could even have a chance at possibly becoming a relevant player in a global currency scene. So I'm going to say it here, I think the Chinese have the tools, but what they need to do there is, it's not so much about policy adjustments, but audacity. They need to relax and understand that relaxing capital controls, creating use cases for offshore RMB is really the only viable means by which we actually get financial and currency multipolarization. And short of that, we're not going to see a world where RMB is a mainstream transactional currency anytime soon. And finally, the final pillar of American dominance, which I noted in the BBC debate I partook in a couple of months ago, was American soft power. as a late Professor Joseph Nye said, it is the ability to convince individuals to do things without resorting to coercion or force, or indeed avert cajoling and pressure. The tragedy and the reality is, with the election or re-election of Donald J. Trump, a gentleman who promises nice things for America, well, what he's ended up doing is dismantling the credibility of the American institutional order in the eyes of many a country that previously looked towards it as a beacon of hope and inspiration. So the old order is on, certainly a decline, and you might say is on demise for now. But I don't think that means it's irrevocable or that this is irreversible. Okay, I think there are very few things that are irreversible about life, apart from aging, within current technological constraints, that is. And beyond aging, there really aren't any irreversible trends that we can say, enough is enough, the West is definitely falling. I don't buy into that narrative. Symmetrically, the new world is yet to be born. Yes, with BRICS we see the rise of countries like, China, India, Russia, South Africa. It's worth noting that really much of the economic contribution and growth and vitality come from China and also India within this coalition of states. And of course, to some extent, Indonesia as well, setting aside recent difficulties and challenges on the ground. But I do not think, as it stands, that BRICS could serve as a coherent replacement to the G7 or to NATO or to the European Union or to any other major long-established inter-country alliances and also entities. Nor is that really the intention on the part of those who are indeed involved in BRICS, because they're not seeking to provide a replacement that could displace or match NATO and all these other entities as they stand. Instead, what we have here is a coalition of convenience, of countries seeking to use one another for securing gains for the regimes, for the people, and also extracting benefits provided that it works out for them. And that's also my characterization and understanding of the current détente between China and India. It is not a long-lasting truce. It is not a long-lasting friendship. It is instead a mutually convenient arrangement for now, kind of like a marriage or a situationship, if you're into that sort of lingo as Gen Zs, of which I'm not a part, like to say these days. The final point then is we live in the age of monsters. For the first time in over 7 decades, there's an invasion on the doorsteps of the European Union of an independent sovereign state by another independent sovereign state. And indeed, whether it be the Middle East or Southeast Asia or Central Africa, we're witnessing the flare-ups and escalation in kinetic and geopolitical tensions and warfare. The world order is becoming increasingly unstable and destabilized. And yet, precisely because there's no clear leading force that can rule above this all, we have to resort to what von der Leyen, the European Commission President, and for the first time in my life I kind of agreed with her, said to be an age of hyper-transactional geopolitics, where countries have to fend for their own interests and think in very cold-blooded and brutally honest and realistic terms. That sets the picture and the scene for where we stand today in relation to BRICS, and that concludes my first point of observation. My other 3 points will be shorter, don't worry. Second point then, on what exactly BRICS is. In my view, the BRICS bloc is a bloc that is oriented around optionality as opposed to a concrete offering. If you ask each of these BRICS nations what they want BRICS to provide for the world, they'll give you 10 different answers. If you ask all the partner countries what they want out of BRICS, they'll give you another 30 to 40 different answers. There's no coherent worldview that underpins these BRICS countries. They do not stand for an alternative order rooted in political meritocracy. They do not stand for a world order rooted in egalitarianism and pro-developing countries' growth. These are nice slogans, these are nice rhetorics. You might hear them trotted out in speeches and propaganda and whatnot, but they do not define a coherent worldview. What these countries instead want out of BRICS is optionality. They want choices. They're sick to the bone of being told by sanctions and instrumental coercion and other forms of influence for their own domestic politics that they cannot or can act in certain ways. They're sick to the bone of the need to rely upon the US dollar as the only means of clearing and resolving transactions. And that ultimately, what they're looking for here is the ability to hedge. And that is something that our colleague, Professor Chen Cui-Quick, has spent over 20 years of his career writing on, and he applies that beautifully to the context of BRICS. Alternatively, as Amitav Acharya says, he's also an author in a book, we live in an era of multiplexity as opposed to multipolarity. So that is what BRICS is. It is not a consistent, unified bargaining bloc. It is not a supranational entity that is as coherent at times begrudgingly so, and perhaps increasingly divided, but still coherent as a European Union, as many of my friends in Europe would agree. It is instead merely a coalition of convenience. And that is the second point I'd like to outline. Now, thirdly, on the pros and cons and opportunities and challenges, right? There are lots of pros I could list out and rattle off my fingers when it comes to why BRICS countries can benefit from more supply chain alignment, more trade integration, renewable energy, collaboration, very important, STEM, knowledge, data gathering, sharing, so on and so forth. But I'm going to put a bit of a downer on BRICS. This is where I'm going to be a skeptic and say there are three fundamental problems that BRICS countries have to tackle in order for this coalition of convenience to really meaningfully take off. And the first challenge they have is the inherent divides and splits within them. UAE versus Iran, China versus India. And we haven't even gone on to the underlying tensions that have long characterized the mistrust between the Chinese and the Russian bureaucracies, right? Of course, the Chinese and the Russian leaderships today seem to be getting along very fine, kumbaya. But that is, of course, contingent upon a whole basket of interest alignments, including over energy, access to the Arctic Circle, water supply, food supply, that could well change if technological constraints or the whims of the Kremlin changed in the future. And as such, the first barrier is disunity within this very bloc itself. And especially if the bloc continues to expand and you add in new members. Maybe Saudi Arabia joins someday if MBS decides that that's right. Okay, where does that leave us? Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the UAE? Well, the Sunni-Shiite conflict is not going away anytime soon, and the assertion that a Wong broken handshake between the two representatives of Saudi Arabia and Iran would therefore put an end to thousands or 1,000 years of mutual enmity and animosity, I find that, frankly, a bit too simple, sometimes naive. So that's the first problem that I outlined here. The second challenge with BRICS concerns the risk of domestic governance failure and instability. From Indonesia to South Africa, from the challenges faced by the theocratic regime in Iran to, of course, what's going on right now in Russia, it is not fair and it is not fundamentally accurate to say that all of these BRICS members are well governed. I think China is well governed, and I'll put that on the record here. I think it is well governed. I also think that India has its own way of doing things, but there are many other members of this bloc that are not well governed and where governmental collapse or failure or challenges are a real and imminent possibility. And I say that despite all my love for both the people and also some of the politicians in Indonesia, where I've spent a lot of my time in, and of course, for the UAE, for South Africa, so on and so forth. But the challenge is to do with internal governance instability that would threaten to derail the tenability of this very coalition. And a final point to note on BRICS is ultimately, what exactly is the purpose of BRICS? What is it about? When countries join BRICS, they say they want optionality. They want more choices. They want to use this as a bargaining chip, as leverage. But when it comes to forming something that's more systematic and coherent, we need more than just opportunism, but willing commitment. It's the difference between a situationship and a marriage, okay? Even though these days, in the Gen Z era, the lines are increasingly blurred, but I believe a marriage should be between individuals who love one another for good and for each other's good, as opposed to for one night of happiness. And that is ultimately what BRICS countries have to contend with. Are they a situationship or are they a real relationship that matters? And that ties me on to the final point today, and welcome to those of you who've just joined us. What is the final point I want to convey here on Hong Kong and BRICS? There's been a lot of talk about what Hong Kong could be in the aftermath of the past few years of development. I'm optimistic about this city, but there's one critical proviso, and that is we need to think actively about what we can do for the world beyond just China and America, right? So 20, 30 years ago, we'd say we're the connector between China and the West. 10 years ago, we'd say we serve China, our great motherland, so on and so forth, insert long-winded, speech. But where is the rest of the world in this vision? Where is India? We have such a wonderful ethnic Indian community here. I actually spent my Tuesday night at a wonderful friend of mine's house, sharing a panel with a group of Nepalis and also Bangladeshis and Indians who spoke about their experiences of being long-standing Hong Kong residents and five-star achievers in their GCSE exams. Is Hong Kong doing enough to engage our own Indian diaspora? I don't think so. Is Hong Kong doing enough to engage and tap into our diaspora from Iran, UAE, Indonesia to provide them with a sense of belonging and to understand what these countries need? I don't think so. So for all the talk of Hong Kong as a super connector, super value adder, which I don't mind, I hear a lot of that, and I'm sure we like listening to these phrases, we need to get down to business and ask ourselves, what can we do for these countries in BRICS? what can we do for countries beyond BRICS in the EU, in the US, in the UK, in Australia, in Canada, and let's not pretend that Hong Kong has the ability to choose or that we can afford to take a firm stance on a global north versus global south struggle, so to speak. I think what Hong Kong needs to do is to bridge the north and the south and to recognize our future rests with both maintaining ties with the European Union, with the US, with the UK and Australia and Canada and the rest of the world, as well as harnessing our capacities to serve our friends in BRICS. And that is something I fundamentally would like to emphasize and call upon all of us here to think more carefully about. And with that said, thank you very much for coming to this talk, and I look forward to your questions and also your thoughts. Thank you.
All right. Great, Brian, as usual. So I'm sort of like a de facto moderator, and we have other experts around the table. After Brian's wonderful talk, I would like to turn to two of our Asia Global Fellows. And by the way, for those of you who just came in, and for those of you who are not familiar with the Asia Global Institute, every year we have 15 to 20 Asia Global Fellows from all around the world in different areas of disciplines to come to Hong Kong and spend 3 months here. And they will talk to many of you. Hopefully, if you didn't get a chance to meet them yet, there will be an opportunity later. But the whole purpose of having Asia Global Fellows is really to create sort of like ambassadors from their own countries, as well as hopefully, if they have some fond memory about Hong Kong later, will be our ambassadors in their home countries. And they have been here for 2 weeks, and for this talk, we invited 2 distinguished Asia Global Fellows out of the 14, Bibik from Nepal, and then Solow from Kazakhstan. And each of them is going to tell us about their perspectives. What do you think about BRICS? From the Central Asia perspective, as well as from South and Southeast Asia perspective. Maybe start with either of you.
Thank you for this opportunity and welcoming us here in Hong Kong. I'm Solow, I'm from Kazakhstan, and yes, I have a few questions to ask. And since Kazakhstan is playing a leading role in Central Asia, and we are full of resources that might be interested for BRICS member countries, I have a question regarding what are the role of Kazakhstan. Is it trying to play, to be a partner of this organization, or we will be a member state soon, and what Kazakhstan should do in balancing power between Russia and China in Central Asia, and what and how we plan Kazakhstan, you see, would be engaging in terms of fields of trade, energy, and infrastructure. Yeah, this might be my question.
Okay, so you take all the geopolitical questions. I take all the econ finance questions, which means that 90% of questions will go to you. But maybe Bibik, you have a question or a comment, or maybe even an answer to Solow.
Hello, my name is Bibik. I'm from Nepal. Probably, if you've been following the news coming from Nepal, we are going through some tough times. Well, that's a different part, which if any of you would love to have a chat, I'm around. But yeah, it's always great to hear you, Brian. And so I just wanted to, like the other day we were talking about India and China, and in terms of where is India as a strength? Is it looking eastward or westward? Because if you look at because India and China being the 2 key members of the BRICS, and also competing members, if you look at India's economic ties, diaspora, the cultural ties, it's more westward compared to the eastward, towards where this is a different strategy, but the economic gravity pulls them eastward. So since you talk about this is a coalition of convenience, and with the entire discussion going around in terms of the rise of new mega regions, like the US leading the North America regions, or the India, if it continues to look eastward, westward, might lead, it has a potential to lead Africa or Eurasia, and China taking the lead more on this side. So where do you see this competing, I don't know if that's a right word, the rivalry, the tension, will it dilute the whole idea of BRICS? And where does this, the philosophy of new world order, where does the BRICS fit into the philosophy of this new order? Yeah, thank you.
So you want to say a few words first, and I will have some.
Sounds
Yeah,
good. Thank you very much for these excellent questions and remarks. I want to just start with Kazakhstan. The first observation is I think Kazakhstan is not a member of BRICS, but it is a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And actually one of my observations from the latest meeting in Tianjin was that the SCO will very likely be via the development bank that it's mulling over setting up, which is going to take a while, I believe that. That fundamentally the SCO is going to be the primary means through which countries, including China, India, to a lesser extent Pakistan, and of course a whole slew of other countries in North Africa who are to varying degrees involved with or partners of the SCO, to access the kinds of mining or the critical raw materials available in abundance in Central Asia. And just for context sake, you know, around 4 months ago in Kazakhstan it was discovered, or at least the Kazakh government claimed to have discovered 20 million tons worth of rare earths. That's pretty impressive. That's like the third largest reserves of such rare earths, if we are to believe them in full, on planet Earth, right? And so that grants Kazakhstan significant bargaining capital leverage, in my view, via the SCO. Whether or not it's in Kazakhstan's interest to join BRICS, I don't know. Sure, joining it gives you more options. It allows you to claim rhetorically that you are open to the idea of a BRICS order. But is it really worth it in terms of the adverse signal that might send to the US or to the West? That's also a calculation that Tokayev has to make himself. And that ties me on to the second question you have, balancing between Russia and China, which has always been a key challenge for Kazakhstan. You know, when you look at, of course, Nursultan Nazarbayev, the first president post-independence of Kazakhstan, he was very adamant about basically deftly, you know, juggling between China and Russia and being friendly to both parties in order to keep Kazakhstan independent and sovereign. But under the new and the second president since independence, Tokayev, Kasim Tokayev, he is essentially someone who understands China very well, having served as an ambassador to China and also being fluent in Chinese. He understands the importance of multiplexity and multi-alignment, which is why he's actually opening up Kazakhstan's doors to Japanese capital, to European ties and the EU, with many delegations visiting over the past 3 years, as well as actually, to some extent, even the USA, you know, which remains a very important destination for higher education for members of the Kazakh elite, right, including some of our mutual friends, so to speak. In fact, if you want to observe regional developments, Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister, traveled to Kazakhstan, I think around a month ago, to convene the inaugural Central Asian Italy Summit, and that speaks to the kind of diplomatic dexterity that Tokayev is now seeking to practice as he leads Kazakhstan into the next era, so to speak. And very quickly then, on the point about India and the tension, you know, between East and West. Do you look south, do you look east, do you look west, or do you look everywhere, right, so to speak? I'm reminded of a debate that raged on in Australia approximately 15 to 20 years ago, when essentially the Australian foreign policy establishment was trying to figure out, is Australia an Asian country, or is it a country that belongs to the Pacific and therefore should look east as opposed to west? India and Australia could not be any more different in many respects. In terms of the quality of food in particular, I think India wins hands down. But with that said, both of them are members of course, the Quad, right? And when we ask, you know, what exactly is the purpose of all of these alliances, Quad, SCO, BRICS, ultimately in the eyes of the Indian leadership, the answer is very simple. It's about strategic maximization of options. They don't want to take sides. They want to look everywhere and look nowhere. But the challenge is, in looking everywhere, there's a risk that India ends up alienating more than it befriends other countries. And that's what India found out the hard way over the past 4 months in relation to Donald Trump, who seems to take the view that because, you know, between India and China, India seems to be someone that America can punch down on, whereas China is tough and is playing hardball. And that is why, you know, whether it be over Russia and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, or alternatively in relation to tariffs, Washington has been more deferential to Beijing than to Delhi. And that, to me, is a pretty damning indictment of the limits to, you know, the sort of Vishwaguru, BJP-led foreign policy for the first couple of years, or rather for the most recent couple of years, not the first couple of years, but those recent couple of years, that may not have played out as well as it could have for Modi, so to speak. So I think what Modi has realized, as advocated by Ajit Doval and also Vikram Misri, right, two very important voices pushing for realignment with China, is that India could walk and chew gum at the same time, and it shouldn't indeed seek to constrict itself or pigeonhole itself into a pro-West country, which it really doesn't have to be, and it ultimately isn't per se. Thank you.
So about India, let me just add a few points. And yesterday we already talked about that in my office. So some of them cannot be discussed publicly, but those points that can be shared publicly would include, I think, within the Indian government, a lot of econ officials were very curious and actually want to have a bit more China plus one benefit. And there's an obvious reason for why they couldn't benefit from all these sort of spun-off supply chains from China into India, like their relatively less developed infrastructure, and sort of like a lack of industrial policy until recently that seemed to be promoting manufacturing. So I have been going to India quite a lot in the last few years. In fact, I'm going there again in 2 weeks. So usually when you see big countries trying to develop some more normal and positive relationship, the track to diplomacy started to happen first. So the fact that all the think tanks and universities invite more Chinese scholars and people from Asia, East Asia to go to India is a good sign that at least they start having the curiosity about what's going on in this part of the world. And I can tell you, in a lot of the events that I participated, there's always a debate about whether India should have more manufacturing as compared to the comparative advantage, which is services. And the second debate that they always had is exactly what you pointed out, whether they should try to turn towards East because they have realized that they have relied a lot on the West for the many decades that we have seen. So I think the major geopolitical mistake that Trump has made since January this year is that they have punched India out of the blue. Modi, I was told, that was extremely shocked, and basically he's encouraging India to really look east and reconsider, as Brian said, potential realignment with the geopolitical and international relations policies with China and other East Asian countries. Kazakhstan, I don't have much to say because I'm going to go there in December. I hope that I will learn more about your country, but I think why not to be a member? But also, what's the benefits to be a member when you can actually be a potential candidate or even an observer for a big group? Given that this is still a very loosely connected group with no obvious infrastructure or institutional binding and commitment, being an observer gives you a lot of options and flexibility to turn west again whenever you need to. So I guess there are a lot of spillovers from BRICs, and you don't really need to be a core member in order to enjoy it. So Brian, if you don't mind, I think we should let the Latin American to say a few things about BRICs. Esteban from the Mexican CG office here. Anything you want to share? Brazil is part of it.
Yeah, Brazil is part of it. Well, I'm happy to be here as I just want to participate in this discussion of a book that I haven't had a chance to read. I mean, I had a couple of questions, maybe not so much from the Latin American point of view, but I guess we can further discuss because they're still relevant. I think from your presentation, I get 2 points that apply both to the geopolitical side and the economic side, and again, some of the arguments. The first one is that on both levels, in both areas, this description basically captures a situation in which, on the one hand, there are things that we've seen and tracks that continue, for example, in terms of how the concept of the group is formulated as an idea and a system of growth, the one we knew before, trade as we knew it. And the second one is this idea of political groupings as a place to provide a la carte multilateralism, if you like, or options. So both of these things we're familiar with. So the question really, if there is something new, and what would that be? New both about BRICS in this new dynamic, not just the number of countries that are joining, but whether it's playing a different role, or rather changing the way in which some of the key components and processes of both the international economy and geopolitics works. And I think in order to ask these questions in a more sort of grounded way, I like to push you on the Gramsci metaphor, So if we are in a moment in which the old world is fading, a new one has not been created, say it's a world of monsters, but is it also a world of organic intellectuals? I mean, is this hyper-transactional way of doing business in which, because of the uncertainty, you have actors of different types, different sizes, going in ways, getting together in groupings that they hadn't done before, didn't have to do before? Does that provide also new opportunities for engagement? That might be giving these configurations much, much more meaning. I think from the case, Latin America, in a way, is familiar with this overlapping groupings and a situation in which basically you have a new topic, you create a new grouping, and so you can have one group to do that, another group to do that, and then in the end it means that you can always see that you're busy and engaged. At the same time, you have great excuses not to carry things forward. I think that might be one of the criticisms that the bigger BRICS grows, the more difficult it would be, as you clearly mentioned, to find coherence and sort of concrete agreements or really programs that are shared through, rather than just ideas or the possibility for sort of ad hoc coordination that is characterized as much. So with that, just Latin America's perspective reverts with some questions, and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you for having me.
Great.
Yes.
I mean, I would say, you mentioned all the important keywords already, right? I think the Western-led world order with leadership from the multilateral organizations that the US plus Europe created had become less relevant for two reasons. First is the share of the GDP in the world has been declining. And second, they didn't want to accept the new reality that they're emerging powers, especially in Asia. So Kishore Mahbubani gave a talk just 2 weeks ago in Hong Kong. And then he said, if you look at all the advanced economies, there's only one country, literally, that managed to maintain a more or less constant share in the global GDP, and that is the US. But the ridiculous thing is, if you look at the UN Security Council, for which he has been a chairman, as well as the World Bank and the IMF, the voting power, the political representation from the, I may say, economically declining West remain the same. I mean, power is something that you get addicted to very easily, right? And of course, it's very rational and legitimate for European powers to continue to hold on to whatever they have in the organizations that they and the US created since the Second World War. But the problem is, when the emerging power felt that they have been left behind and that their interests were not being represented, then they went out to create their own, right? I mean, there are so many of them, right? RCEP, and now there's a CPTPP, which was initially proposed by Obama and Hillary Clinton back in the days in the US, as well as, right, obviously the China-initiated development banks like New Development Bank for BRICS, the AIIB with a headquarters in Beijing, and now, Xi Jinping just talked about creating a SCO development bank as well. So I guess, these are all pragmatic and practical solutions to the fact that the original leading multilateral organizations were not doing the job, right? I don't even have to talk about what I've been studying, and that is the overdue reforms in the WTO, right? I mean, basically, there's no effective solutions made by the WTO since the Doha round that was concluded in the 90s. So I guess, I would quote the famous Indian economist at Columbia University, Jagdish Bhagwati. He used to say that, regional trade agreements with all these sort of overlapping alliances are like a big spaghetti bowl. It's inefficient, and there should be a leading and truly multilateral institution to lead the global economy and different kind of collaboration. But the problem is there's no leading, in my opinion, no leading multilateral organization that is really able to overcome at least the most important bilateral tension in the world, meaning the one between the US and China. So therefore, we just have to live in an inefficient world for a while before we can successfully and peacefully transform ourselves into the multipolar or multimodal or multiplex world that was being called by different scholars around the world. Brian?
Just one point to add, and I know I've been quite skeptical thus far about the extent to which BRICS could, materialize in substantive breakthroughs or benefits for its members. But I'm going to sort of, switch to a different tack, and I'm going to argue that ultimately there are choices that can be made and undertaken by members of this bloc that, if implemented, appropriately, could drive forward real usages of this BRICS coalition of the convenience. If we look at what the Beijing, the Zhongyang Zhengfu, so what the parties come up with over the past couple of years in terms of global initiatives, they're known as 全球倡议. So there are four main global initiatives that we can keep an eye out for. The first is global civilizational, the second is global security, the third is global development, and the fourth is global governance, which just came out rather recently. These four initiatives, at the very least when it comes to GCI, GDI, GGI, and I'm going to set aside GSI for now because that's a bit hairy, even though even the advocates and proponents of GSI also have no idea what exactly GSI is about. But GCI, GDI, and also GGI could well be the overarching mission that BRICS could orient itself towards in theory. For instance, take global governance, right? Climate change is a very important part of international governance. Regulating the risks and challenges of AI, especially unbridled, rise of potentially non-aligned AI, paperclip thought experiment, all of that, that's also part of governance issues. Macroeconomic stabilization, that's part of global governance. And then when it comes to global development, food security and ensuring that there's equitable access to food and water, ensuring that countries can access developmental loans without having these loans either sucked up or taken up by their elite, or alternatively imposed with extremely harsh conditions that are borderline basically regime or institution altering. That's also part of what GDI could well offer. And finally, GCI, Civilization Initiative, this is where people-to-people exchanges, education, youth dialogues, all of that could hypothetically fit in. So my presupposition is if BRICS can develop some sort of this trifecta, GCI, GDI, and GGI, in a manner that does not exclusively orient or align these initiatives that they develop to just the whims of any particular country, so it's not a China-owned thing or a Russia-owned thing or an India-owned thing, but a BRICS co-owned set of initiatives, then in that case it could really be key to BRICS, right? Because what we get then in BRICS is not so much the kind of multilateral institutions of rules and also deliberation and discussion as per the IMF or World Bank or the UN, nor is it, however, sort of mini-lateralism that we've seen in the form of AUKUS or Quad, these blocks between individual countries. It's sort of like a hybrid, okay, that adds teeth and depth to initiatives advanced by particular member states that transform them into one where you can actually have more open discussions and deliberation within the institutions of BRICS. But a key caveat to all of this happening is that BRICS must be more than just a talking shop. And even if there's talk, the talk needs to be fair. It can't just be one or two countries screaming and shouting and shoving their views down the throats of all the other states, because that's not talking, that's lecturing, which is ironically kind of what I've done. Which is ironically what I sometimes do, not necessarily today, not today, sir. It's very important to note that we need to ensure that it's a bidirectional and multi-directional sort of process of conferral and discussion, so to speak. So I'm not pessimistic per se. I just think the huge challenges that BRICS have to overcome in order to unlock these dividends and fruits.
Great. So Casey Kwok, the director of the Asia Global Fellows Program here, has something to say.
Well, continuing Brian's earlier point about talking, not lecturing, let me just give you a different perspective to what I hear. Well, I used to be an economist working in the private sector in the past, and when I was working as an economist in the private sector, I sat on a number of government committees on the trade related to trade, cross-boundary investments and things like that. And then I worked for a while in the Hong Kong government, and I supported the government's trade negotiations. And therefore, I want to say a few things related to this, bowl of spaghettis. You talk to the trade negotiators, the foreign diplomats, and so on. I think if you talk to them, people like George Yao, who has talked to us, he kept emphasizing the need to keep talking. Even if you don't get a conclusion, a consensus, you keep on talking. And that is very important. I mean, from a diplomatic angle. There was a time when the Asia Free Trade Agreement means AFTA. And the joke was agree first, talk again. even if you don't agree, let's keep talking. And therefore, there are lots and lots of trade negotiations, diplomatic talks, which do not necessarily come out with very good and very quick results. But you need to continue talking. And therefore, to your earlier point about, does BRICs have really, some common purpose? Do they really agree on anything? They have lots of conflicts and so on. Well, I hold a slightly different view. Even if you have different views, you need to keep talking. And also, I think going back to the earlier point by Heiwai, when the global multilateral order is slowly collapsing, or perhaps you mentioned this, I think the world is in search of new institutions, and it is not going to be easy. And therefore, whether it is SCO or BRICs or other organizations, I think we can look at it as efforts in the search of new global institutions. Perhaps not global, but you have to live with the fact that, well, you need more and more regional platforms so that the world is going to be multimodal. You may not necessarily have one dominant institution ruling the world or running the world. So I look at these regional groupings in a more positive angle. But despite all that, going back to how important these regional groupings really are, as an economist, well, I haven't done any serious academic research on this subject, but my experience told me that, well, let the trade negotiators talk. These are all lawyers. They all try to squeeze, I relax a little bit, you relax more for me. Otherwise, why should I relax that little bit? As economists, we think that, well, why don't you guys, just keep on relaxing? And actually, economic forces force a lot of countries to unilaterally relax. If you don't relax your foreign investment restrictions, you are kidding yourself. If you don't lower your trade restrictions, you harm yourself. And therefore, economic forces actually force a lot of countries to unilaterally reduce their trade and investment restrictions. You can't rely on the trade negotiators because they need to continue to negotiate, the diplomats need to continue talking, but real economic progress, real trade, real cross-boundary investment are driven much more by economic forces. And of course, in the last few decades, also by technological development. The containerization of world trade, I think, made a much greater contribution than all these trade agreements. Digitalization of trade and the supply chain, I think, contributed a lot more to trade and investment than all these trade negotiations. So I think the real world will continue to grow and develop despite all these political talks. But of course, if we have a better world, with better discussions, the world will move even further. But despite all that, I'm not that pessimistic.
Thank you so much, Casey. And in fact, the book covers quite lots of non-geopolitical aspects about BRICS, including digitization of different economies, how BRICS itself can form a very effective innovation ecosystem. Quinn Lee from University of Korea, SNU, Seoul National University in Korea, actually wrote a wonderful piece about how industrial policy, introduced now mostly by Western countries, together with the vibrant innovation ecosystem that has been developed individually in different BRICS countries, but also collectively between different members, have been creating new solutions for the world.
And Ong Kian Ming also wrote a chapter on digital trade and digitalization amongst BRICS members as well.
Right. Okay, so if there's no more comments or questions from the table, let me turn to the people around the table. Sorry for people who are standing, but I see that most of you are young, so you can withstand the physical challenge for an hour.
Hi, thank you everyone for such a lively and vibrant non-lecture discussion, right? So my name is Galvin. I'm an economist with the Trade Development Council, and I'd like to pick myself as a long-standing friend of the AGI, right? I just have a question, maybe to go back to the title of the book, because we're here to hear a little bit about the book talk, right? And towards a future for BRICS. So maybe in the context of where we are now in the global sort of economic and trade cycle, right? Everyone is worried about, or nominally quite worried about tariffs and what's that going to happen to trade, with this idea that the center of global economic trade has been centered around the US. US final demand, right? And there's been a shock to that because of tariffs and, okay, we're not quite sure what's going to happen there. And then everyone's trying to figure out, well, what's going to happen to the trajectory of all these other economies around the world, like sort of orbiting the US final demand, right? So in the context of, let's say, BRICS, or let's take BRICS maybe, right? So like from my limited understanding, I think about Brazil, Russia, India, and South Africa in the traditional formulation, that these are relatively more either export-oriented or sort of closed economies reliant on sort of self-generated demand, right? Or they supply sort of commodities and intermediate goods, whereas China has become like the buyer of last demand for intermediate goods and the supplier of everything else on Amazon.com or whatever, right? So what, in this world where we are worried about the shocks to trade flows and trade policy, kind of where do you, and in the absence of a driving, let's say, economic structure to this BRICS arrangement, what is the future or the role of BRICS, in the next 5 years, let's say?
Should we take 2 more questions? Yeah. So, any more?
Hello, my name is Averill. I had a very related question. So BRICS is, I think Brian's point is well understood to be at least politically somewhat of a negative definition, but there may be more of a positive economic definition going forward. To me, economically, BRICS seems mostly unified by Russia trying to principally export energy and certain agricultural goods mostly to China and India, and Brazil, of course, exporting a lot of agricultural goods to China, and South Africa providing a variety of other mostly primary and intermediate goods. But to see a true multipolar, or perhaps multiplex would be not quite what I'm looking for, trade agreement, you would have to expect more of an alignment on a lot of key trade issues. I mean, the Doha round ultimately failed in large part due to difficulties over agricultural goods being very, very hard, and Russia's chiefly was quite in favor of the bloc that supported lowering agricultural tariffs. Whereas India and China were both much more mixed on that front. How integrated can BRICS truly be economically when so many of the countries have a long-standing commitment to be autarkic, especially on these very key and very contentious goods?
All right, one more.
Yeah, thank you for the sharing. I want to share a perspective from nature. So because just now we mentioned about what's the spirit of BRICS to getting together, right? So if the climate is so bad, and then the well-developed North hemispheres, their economy is going to turn into a Sahara. So that's the reason we need to develop global South, firstly. And then, and then Brazil is closest to the equator. So if there's anything we need to send to the space, they are closest. So just now you mentioned about like the old and new and the talking and the digital supply chain is faster than talking, right? So my question is, so how do you see, and you also mentioned about the currency, right? Like the dominance currency and how can enable RMB to have go offshore international. So my question is, what if like the BRICS, plus they can have a new currency that is bound or like exchange with carbon credit, emission tokens, and then to enable this supply chain management. I don't know. I don't know if this is a way of thinking, but how do you see all these things like carbon trading, carbon emission, and blockchain-enabled supply chain? Can it be a new force to drive good quickly for the planet? Thank you.
So the short answer to your question is read the book. You will find all the answers. But the long answer. So let me go in reverse order because my memory is limited. So I think you asked 2 questions, right? One is really about BRICS as a group to introduce a currency that may or may not be able to threaten the US dollar dominance. Brian, in his very long introduction, already said I think the US dollar dominance could not be threatened so easily in the short run. And I actually don't know how BRICS 5 different countries with very strong central banks individually will be able to come up with a solution to share the common currency, right? You know, the PBOC of China obviously has the largest concern about capital outflows. You know, there's only one person who took BRICS currency seriously, and that is Donald Trump. And whenever Donald Trump says something negatively, that thing will actually have a higher chance to be to succeed. So you know, if someone asks me, you know, who would be the major supporter for BRICS currency, it would be Trump, rather than PBOC. So that's sort of my half politically correct answer to your second question. But the first question really about digitization, sustainability, supply chains, and how these 5 countries can collaborate together with the new members. I think there is huge room for them to come up with growth promoting solutions. And it is also related to the second question raised by the gentleman over there, and that is these countries are at most middle income country, and most of them are still in a developing state. So you guys are familiar with the food pyramid, right? You know, when you had enough carbohydrates, then you start thinking about protein and maybe eating organic food. So part of the challenge for the Western-led order that has helped globalization for the last 4 decades is they started talking about things that developing countries don't care about, right? Like, you know, protection of human rights, to be honest, is hugely important. But if you talk to a developing country that still had a lot of poverty and, you know, food supply shortages, then, you know, maybe they want more, relatively more economic development and some technological solutions which can help them to increase their productivity. So, you know, the reason why, you know, Doha round, after Doha round, there's no more successful cases coming out from the WTO is really advanced economies who had strong protection for their agricultural sector that has stopped, you know, ongoing discussion. And also, it is also advanced economies that are very concerned about their data security and, you know, their own domestic services that has stopped more discussion about, you know, the next round of trade, and that is service trade or service globalization. So therefore, I think BRICS, given their relatively low economic development, is a blessing that they will be more pragmatic, and they, you may argue, less concerned about, you know, all this, you know, noble ideology that, you know, developed democracies would like to focus on more. Again, you know, I keep talking about the food pyramid. You know, I'm not saying that human rights are not important, democracy is bad, but, you know, there's a stage for you to get there, and the way to get there is really to try to use, you know, all the new supply chain techniques and, you know, maybe all the digital technologies that you had in mind to really help them to grow at the next stage. There was a question about U.S. tariffs and, you know, all the trade wars that are happening around the world, mostly started by one country. I would say, I mean, I spent quite a lot of time in the U.S. U.S. is a fantastic country, like what Trump would say all the time. And it is fantastic because, you know, people love to consume. And it's a very integrated market for a bad reason, and that is you have all this retail wholesale being monopolized by the big names, right? You know, call it Walmart, Costco, or Target, whatever. So therefore, you know, with a country that contributed 25% of global GDP and over 1/3 of global consumption, it is really hard to diversify away from it, right? You know, I traveled to mainland China talking to a lot of factories owners, and they obviously tried very hard in the last 5 years to be less dependent on the U.S. But most of the time, they failed. I mean, they had this sort of policy agenda to do it, so, you know, they would report one set of numbers, and that is in terms of revenue shares, the U.S. part is shrinking while the domestic part is increasing. But on the other hand, if you look at the profit share, it remains the same, right? There's one particular company in Dongguan who I talked to. First answer is that, well, you know, they used to have 80% goods sold to the U.S. and 20% domestic, and now it's reverted. But then he told me, Professor Tang, in terms of profit shares, it's still 80% from the U.S. and 20% in China. So I think the world, especially exporting companies, are still heavily dependent on the U.S. for, you know, the 2 obvious reasons that I mentioned. But the world is changing, and, you know, there are more middle-class consumption coming out from new emerging markets. But those markets are very hard to sell your goods to, right? It's fragmented. I mean, you work at TDC, you know better than me. So your chairman, Fred Ma, is trying very hard to reposition all the offshore branches of TDC, and hopefully that the supply chains and the trade networks will be more efficient to sell goods from China through Hong Kong. I've said enough, so Brian, anything to add?
Yeah, just a couple of points. I think the first thing to note is I was at Summer Davos this year, and Premier Li Qiang, being Li Qiang, basically said he wants to position China as a consumption superpower and a consumption powerhouse, and that's what he pledged. And of course, you can read that as just platitude and rhetoric, but I'm inclined to believe that at least something's changed over the past couple of years at technocratic and a leadership level within the State Council concerning the emphasis upon consumption. And if my assessments are correct, there would soon be a slew of announcements coming out concerning incorporating consumption into local government and provincial government KPIs, or key performance indicators. What this speaks to fundamentally is, I think China has come to realize, or the Chinese leadership, including the CPC leadership, but predominantly the technocrats at the top of the State Council or the upper mid-echelons of the State Council, they've come to the realization that you cannot have excessive dependence upon the American market, because that is a huge strategic liability. And yet, despite the past 17 years of continued pledges of increasing consumption, 扩大内需, 减免, or bolstering a so-called inner circulation, 内循环, they've struggled thus far with actually improving consumption ratios, right? We often say China saves too much, okay? Or the Chinese people save too much and they consume too little, and much of that actually reflects structural challenges to do with, in part the one-child policy, or concerns over post-retirement pensions, or worries over social security, or challenges to do with, of course, the wages, right? And what's happened for a very long while with regards to wages for laborers in China. All of these have to change. All of these have to change fast. All of these are not changing fast enough. The third plenum last year spoke to the need to position China as an increasingly self-sufficient consuming power by undertaking these structural reforms are long overdue. I really hope that China succeeds, because that means that in lieu of seeing America as the only sort of repository of consumption, China can actually start buying more domestically and importing more. But that's going to take, in my view, a couple of years in order for all the vested interests to be overcome. And despite the rise and the growth of the middle class, which I hope will continue, but that again is contingent upon tackling youth unemployment and all the other economic issues and worries that China currently has. And what I will say on top of that, though, is Indonesia, which is the fourth most populous country in the world, largest Muslim democracy, also has a growing middle class. It shrank during the pandemic due to the inequalities that were exacerbated in part by the disruptions to supply chains and trade. But I'm cautiously hopeful that provided the right policies are implemented, in other words, more transparency with Dan and Tara, and also let's just hope that Prabowo sort of, now that Sri Mulyani is gone, he can at least find someone who is half as good as Sri Mulyani to be back in that position as finance minister, and maybe Mary Pangetsu, who knows. Getting folks of that caliber to drive forward truly pro-middle class policies is vital, because otherwise, Indonesia might also run into its own rut, so to speak, when it comes to growing the size of its market. The same could be said, of course, of all the other BRICS member states. Increasing consumption is not something that's impossible. It is possible. But the challenge is, how can you substitute for the American market? And that's also Donald Trump's calculus. That's why he says, the ability to access the American market is a privilege, and hence all the tariffs and restrictions you've seen rolled out in recent years. And second and final point I want to make adds on to what you said, Heiwai, which is the idea that Trump is the best backer for the BRICS currency, or the cause of a BRICS currency to some extent. I don't think that's a flippant remark. Trump is really into cryptocurrencies. His son's also very into cryptocurrency. His whole family's into cryptocurrencies. They love crypto. And because of that, they also loved Hong Kong, for Hong Kong's work in crypto, whatever that means, okay, at the recent conference. There's a possibility for BRICS countries adopting stable coins that are essentially parallel to, central bank issued currencies, right? So yes, you're right, the onshore RMB, the rupee, all of these various disparate currencies are going to be controlled by fairly centralized top-down central banks. And yet there's a possibility of a BRICS stable coin emerging if it could be tethered to a basket of BRICS currencies. But of course the challenge there is I don't think a stable coin that's attached to just BRICS currencies is going to have that much uptake or usage, simply because of the fluctuations in value and valuations. So if I were truly driving forward a BRICS stable coin, and I'm not, because I'm not into this, but if I were, I would say let's take a look at a bundle or basket with pounds sterling, with euro, and also the Japanese yen, plus a handful of BRICS countries, and we formulate basically a relatively stable, pun intended, a stable backing or foundation for the stable coin, and encourage, folks to issue in a private capacity and also to use this BRIC stable coin, not in substitute for or of, but in parallel with the existing currencies across BRICS plus nations. So that's what I think could make sense from a sort of currency point of view, but I don't necessarily see anyone thinking too much about this apart from maybe certain research teams within PBOC, which I'm sure are interested in the relevance of stable coins, and that's why we're seeing a lot of pressures and also announcements over the past 6 months concerning Hong Kong as a stablecoin issuance center. It's not a Hong Kong originating thought. This is a thought that I think is aligned with the national strategy of China as a whole, and that's also, I'll leave it at that really. Thank you.
Yeah. So I have something more to say about trade, but why don't we take 3 more questions? If there's no more conversation, then I will go back to trade. So 2 over here.
Hi, I'm Sonal. I'm one of the AGI fellow this year. So my question is around that, what are the risks of BRICS, fragmenting internally based on the different geopolitics and the political systems of its own members? So what are the risks in future for the BRICS? Yeah.
Thank you. I've been talking about BRICS with my students, it's my night job, for about 16 years, mostly mainland. And basically I agree with what you said, Brian, at the end, sort of that summary, the positive aspects and the aspects that are not working so well. But I want to ask about one of the things that BRICS has done, which also fits into what you've been saying. They've actually created a bank, the New Development Bank, as you know, from the very beginning, often unfairly compared and confused with the Asia Infrastructure Development Bank, but it shouldn't be, and it's probably unfair to both. How important is that, do you think, and especially going forward for BRICS to be effective? Is that a way of perhaps making a mark for itself in the region and beyond?
Maybe one more. Yeah, over there first. Yeah, he has the mic, so. Yeah.
Hi, I'm a UG1 student for Hong Kong U, studying in the Faculty of Social Science. Thank you for today's discussion. I would like to ask about regarding creating a collective investment and development strategy for BRICS, especially given the competing national interests and policies of major BRICS nations. How would they specifically be able to deepen their trade relations and, for example, as you said, the supply chains, despite these rather like structural incongruencies, which you might have touched on previously?
Well, I'm Jean-Pierre Cabestin, Emeritus Professor at Hong Kong Baptist University. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this great, very lively presentation. I have a question about the future of the BRICS. There is a word you haven't mentioned, which is the Global South. So is the aspiration of the BRICS to identify eventually with the Global South? I'm happy you've mentioned these global governance initiative, because it's much more distinct to the Global South as a whole, and to the whole world. So, and here you've got a tension between the BRICS, which is a collection of powers, middle powers, but regional powers, promoting multipolarity, and the GGI, which is promoting multilateralism, which is very different, which puts every state on the same footing, on the same level. So which is the same, same voice, the same weight to every country. So here you've got a tension, and I don't know, whether the future of the BRICS is to really embrace the Global South or to remain a multipolar setting aimed at challenging what you've said, which has been over for quite a while, unipolarity. I mean, we were clearly in a multipolar world, but the multipolar world is, it's a fact. It's not a way of working together. So here you've got a tension between multipolarity and multilateralism, I guess. So that's my question. So, and one of the scenarios you haven't envisaged in your remarks is the collapse of the BRICS. Maybe maybe it's gonna come to an end one day. There is no question mark. Very, very often academics put a question mark at the end of their title, but there is a plus instead of a question mark. So maybe eventually you are, despite the weaknesses you've mentioned, Brian. So do you mean by the weaknesses are not going to lead the BRICs to an end? Actually, despite the weaknesses you've mentioned, the BRICs are going to survive. So that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. So a couple of thoughts. I'm going to try and respond to questions 1, 3, Mark, and 4 in one go, and then I'll leave the NDB question to my far more learned and esteemed colleague, Professor Heiwai Tang. As I see it, I think, firstly, I do not think the world we live in today is multipolar. That's my personal opinion. I think it is still a unipolar world by all intents and purposes. When it comes to military strength and geopolitical security, America remains by far the superior and dominant power when it comes to military presence abroad, when it comes to number of military bases, number of wars it fights for pleasure or otherwise on an annual basis. It just far supersedes China. China's fought 3 major wars since independence. You can literally count the Korean War, Sino-Indian, and also Sino-Vietnamese. I think America, for many of our American friends, a war a day keeps peace away. So that's just one quick thought there. But of course, the unipole is declining. There's destabilization, and China, in economic and supply chain and trade terms, you could say has overtaken America, arguably. But that's only in certain dimensions, right? And when it comes to more broadly speaking, whilst there's a rise of regional centers and regional poles and even shudder regional hegemonies, that's one way of looking at it. I don't think any of these hegemonies or powers is at the level of America today. So that's why I don't actually think multipolarity is a description of status quo. We're not, there's a tension between multilateralism and multipolarity. That actually is a beautiful question because it speaks to an innate commitment problem as I see it in BRICS today. And here's a possible sort of dichotomy, and hopefully it's a continuum, but realistically it's a dichotomy. One way of looking at BRICS is that it is a low commitment, very loose bloc. You don't have to buy into certain conditions. You don't have to change the way macroeconomic policies or trade policies work on your own domestic turf. Okay, so it's low commitment, and therefore it's low cost, right? I join, I don't join, I join now, I leave later, I get married, divorce, no problem. Okay, that's fine, right? That's one way of looking at BRICS. And in that world, then, of course, the inequalities and also the inegalitarianism that we've touched upon here as manifesting through different power centers for their own interests would, of course, play out, but the level of perniciousness and harms that this would therefore impose upon the members of BRICS would be lower because there are costs and a barriers to exit, and also the extent to which there's a domestic interference or alterations of domestic constellations and arrangements is considerably lower. That's one scenario and one pathway that BRICS could manifest as. But another pathway is that it is a high commitment, highly selective, high cost bloc, right? So if you want to join, you have to pay up, you have to change, you have to accept conditions almost like you're joining the WTO. And in that case, because of the extent of commitment, you therefore have fewer members, a more selective admission set of criteria or set of admissions criteria, but also presumably more sharing of dividends and benefits. And why is that the case? Because in order for these restrictions to be politically palatable in those countries that are seeking to join BRICS, there has to be clear upsides and benefits. Otherwise, it doesn't make any domestic political sense for leaders to say, I've joined BRICS. So in those cases, you might see more egalitarian distributions of the benefits of goods and access to commodities and rare earths and whatnot, but you'd have a far smaller BRICS overall than the current one that we see, let alone the one it might eventually morph into. And of course, there's a third scenario, which is that BRICS prevaricates between these two pathways. It gets very confused, everyone's confused, and by the end of it, it just ends up as a fizzling out of nothing burger, as someone once said about BRICS to Heiwai and I in a relatively direct review of the idea. And the fourth scenario is you get collapsed because of the attempt by one or more powers to co-opt and turn BRICS into their own backyard. That is certainly a possibility. That is certainly something we can't rule out. But thus far, I would say I haven't seen signs of any member state overtly seeking to turn BRICS into a sort of fiefdom or a uniquely possessed kingdom that is firmly aligned with them across economic, commercial, and trade dimensions as well. And that ties me on to the final sort of comment I'm going to make concerning essentially how can we make the alignment sexy to overcome or ameliorate the kinds of conflicts that there's a worry and concern over. And to me, elite buy-in is essential. and that's why I mentioned GDI, GCI, GSI, and also GGI, right, as an example of elite buy-in from China. Alternatively, from the BJP leadership, the idea of a Vishwaguru, the world's teacher, you know, on which Kate Sullivan de Estrada has written quite a lot of articles on in dissecting the psyche of the Modi leadership. All in all, the question here is not just can we get BRICS to mean something to the people of BRICS countries, but also can we get the elite of BRICS countries to see value in the concessions to lift the kind of trade barriers and the restrictions that we've talked about that thwarted or undermined progress beyond the Doha round of negotiations. And I remain cautiously optimistic about that, given how, you know, Russia in many ways has basically put all its eggs into the basket of BRICS to a very large extent. And even beyond BRICS, then, you know, what are the non-BRICS countries that Russia is engaging with? Cuba, Vietnam, you know, these are also countries that see, and you know, whether it be through resonance or interest reasons, value resonance or interest resonance, reasons to engage with BRICS, right? So Russia, there's definitely elite buy-in. China, there's elite buy-in because it feeds into China's attempt to project an image of a globally responsible stakeholder and a progenitor of a so-called, you know, egalitarian global order. And the same can be said of a lesser extent about India, South Africa, Brazil, Indonesia under Prabowo Subianto, and also, of course, you know, BRICS is a lifeline to Iran, which by all intents and purposes is a struggling regime economically, and despite its political sort of relative stability and order. What I find more interesting is Ethiopia, Egypt, and UAE, about which we haven't really talked about sufficiently today, and for that, you know, I think we should definitely spend the next 20 minutes or so thinking about, given that we still have the time to do so. So I'll leave it at that, and over to you, Heiwai.
I mean, the question also touches on Global South, right? And I think, you know, with, you know, the new members joining BRICS now, making it a 10-member group, is really an expansion of an originally loosely connected alliance with, you know, almost no institutional binding, as, you know, both Brian and I agreed, to allow more countries to join as long as they share something that they think will be useful for the current stage of development. As of, you know, whether, you know, BRICS or BRICS Plus would be getting more formalized and, you know, more institutionalized, I am not cautiously optimistic, but I don't think, you know, this group needs to be very robustly institutionalized because, you know, given, you know, all the geopolitical situations that you all have seen, it is actually better to have more inclusive groups like this one, and by the way, RCEP. And by the way, you know, I've been a director of the APEC Study Center. And interestingly, people are talking about APEC again. And remember, APEC has both the US and China. You know, how can people talk about APEC again? Because, you know, APEC is such a loosely intellectually connected group of people, like professors like me, who are highly irrelevant. And they come together every year to talk about so-called global issues with no actual policy or tangible policy recommendations. But the relative value has increased, right? Because, you know, a lot of things cannot be discussed because of politics. But if you have this sort of 20th century organization that somehow can bring people from the US and China together, hopefully in China next year, then maybe, you know, there's something more tangible, something more positive that will come out down the road. So I guess, you know, even though I myself personally would not take BRICS like, you know, a solid organization like what I would take the WTO or the IMF, I still think, you know, the value is very important, especially in the long run. About New Development Bank and as compared to AIIB, I don't have the actual number, but, you know, New Development must be much smaller than AIIB, and AIIB is still smaller than ADB, Asian Development Bank, in terms of the investment. And, you know, the biggest contributor to development finance is still the World Bank. And interestingly, various Chinese government-controlled policy banks. But again, you know, the strategic value is probably bigger than the actual financial value. I mean, you need sort of a central point to get people together. If the recipient countries are small, right, not like India or you know, Brazil, then, you know, the relative impact will be big, right? So I guess, you know, it will increase the attractiveness of BRICS, you know, if the New Development Bank will continue to get more funding from the other members. But, you know, as of now, I don't have the number, but, you know, I would be surprised, you know, if the contribution to global development funding is higher than 3%. Yeah. Should we take 5 more minutes? And then, because, you know, I want to end before 2 because I want to sell more copies of the books. And, you know, Brian and I would love to sign some of them.
Yes.
Thank you so much for your profound insights and wisdom, Professor Wong and Professor Tang. Just two quick questions. How important is comparative advantage nowadays? Then second question, in one sentence, what's your best hope and fear for BRICS? Thank you.
Best hope and fear, I'll leave it to you. But I will take the CA question.
Okay, so firstly, I'd like to thank you for your insights. I have a question regarding diplomacy. So there's track 1 and track 2 diplomacy. But I'd like to explore a little about track 2 diplomacy because it concerns non-governmental actors. But however, from my experiences with talking to sort of people about diplomacy, people who are non-governmental actors who are not directly involved in diplomacy, but instead, for example, taxi drivers, construction workers, they also have very great and very insightful insights regarding diplomacy. So regarding that, how can these insights of these people who do not have direct roles to play in the diplomatic process, regarding, for example, track 1 and track 2 diplomacy, what do the opinions of these people and these players have in the development of BRICS and in the development of how governments within the BRICS coalition have to dictate policies?
Thank you. Just ask a question that you always ask.
Another question? One more question? The more the merrier. Anyone?
Anyone?
Can I just quickly add?
It would be great, but I want to be egalitarian, so only if no one else has questions, then our two wonderful esteemed fellows. Anyone else with questions?
Okay, there's
yes,
one more.
The gentleman at the back.
So let's take the last one. This is
That's the last question.
Unfortunately, I wasn't able to attend the Belt and Road Summit this week, but given if anything transpired there, would there be anything you'd like to amend to your book in light of anything that could have happened? I'm not sure if there was anything new that was mentioned at that summit this week here.
I didn't go to the Belt and Road Summit. We have a TDC representative here. We have a TDC representative here, so maybe you can tell us.
Yes. Okay. All right. Professor Tang, would you
well, there's a question about comparative advantage. The interesting thing is, I taught international trade for 20 years. For the first 16 years, the attendance in my class is less than 20%, because comparative advantage is what I talked about all the time, and it's boring, and to most of the people is not the most exciting thing to discuss. I mean, it takes like 2 minutes to explain it, but I somehow managed to extend it to 2 semesters. But today, in the last 5 years, 80+% of my class is about geoeconomics, right? How political tension between big powers will shape trade and investment flows. So I guess comparative advantage should still be the driving force for efficient economic development, but unfortunately it is on the side for now and probably in the next 10 years. But one thing that I was going to say in response to the question from TDC, and also now you asked about comparative advantage and therefore trade, is in Trump 1.0 from 2016 to 2020, there has been something called China plus one or China plus N. I mean, I don't know whether Trump understood, but now he probably was convinced by some of his advisors that the tariffs imposed by the US on China actually help China on the net. In the sense that you have a lot of Chinese companies going out, partly because of the tariffs from the US, but partly because the Chinese market is overly competitive. So therefore, the original, more regionalized supply chains of Chinese companies become more global. I'm not saying that they're profitable. I'm not saying that this kind of China plus one strategy is efficient, but just that China, because of the China plus one, has become more connected to global South, especially in Southeast Asia and now the Middle East. There's a paper that I always recommend people to read. You may think I'm biased, and I probably is, but a paper written by 2 Harvard professors. One is Josh Lerner from the Harvard Business School, and the other one is David Yang, who has been a great political economist, sometimes probably a bit anti-communist, so that gives a bit more credibility for his work to say that China plus one actually make China more influential through not only financial networks, but actually innovation influence. So they looked at, in particular, patent citations, and realized that a lot of companies and universities in the global South are now citing innovation coming out from China rather than from Cambridge, Massachusetts, or Cambridge, the UK. So therefore, that is, in my opinion, the true soft power of China, rather than culture, philosophy, which have been great, but not very accessible to people who don't really speak the language. So that's my quick response, and there are two more about track 2.
Okay.
So I already answered the question about the Belt and Road. Okay. So your turn about track 2, like should we have track 3 diplomacy for the taxi drivers?
One of the most intense and informed debates I've had on the Israel-Gaza or Israel-Palestine conflict was with a Shanghai taxi driver who spent the entirety of the cab ride from Pudong through to my airport, through my hotel in Wuxi, lecturing me about Israel. So I thought that was a very interesting discussion. It goes to show that actually the people do care and the people do think. And I think, Heiwai, you said track 3 in jest, right? But I actually think track 3 diplomacy, which is public diplomacy or public-to-public diplomacy, is absolutely vital. I don't think just because we're ordinary citizens that we should therefore stop commenting on or thinking about politics on the international stage. You may not care about geopolitics, but geopolitics is going to come to you regardless. It's a bit like 7-Eleven. So, no, maybe not. Bad analogy. But you get a gist here, right? You cannot run away from geopolitics. What I often say to my students is, you might think that you're not in a position to become a diplomat or a very influential investor or run a think tank, but who knows? And even if you're not, that doesn't mean that you couldn't, in your own capacity, serve as a bridge builder and also somebody that hopefully clear up as opposed to contributing towards the bad blood between countries, especially in this age of monsters. The second point to note is I think Hong Kong really needs to focus on what these other countries that are trying to port actually need. When we say we want to be a super value adder, we want to be a super connector, okay, fine, I get it. These words are very catchy. I guess some of them are. But what does that mean? When we're adding value, we've got to first figure out what is the value that other countries value. Because otherwise, we're going to be sitting here talking to ourselves, we have great rule of law, great financial infrastructure, great legal services, we came up and down in this ranking, that ranking, dim sum ranking, legal ranking, panda ranking. But the problem is, what does that mean for the countries like Indonesia, or Malaysia actually, for that matter? I had a great coffee with a dear friend of mine who works closely with PMX in Malaysia. He was just telling me yesterday, right, what can we do together, Hong Kong and Malaysia? Well, he genuinely wants to know. And so I said, what about halal tourism? And he said, well, that's no good because that competes with Malaysia, right? Because Malaysia does halal tourism for halal needing individuals. Hong Kong now wants to do halal tourism, which is great from a point of view of receptiveness and welcomeness towards our friends who are Muslims, but may not necessarily be conducive towards the economic interests of Malaysia. So there's a complexity that we have to think about as well, right? And finally, on the question on my fear and my hope, I'm feeling hopeful about the fact that now countries in BRICs and who may be able to join BRICs in the future can say no. That's my hope. That's what gives me hope, that they can say no. But my fear is that they can only say no, as opposed to saying yes to something else. So that's my fear. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Yeah, so let me conclude by saying that Asia Global Institute is a platform for track 2 or track 2.5 discussions and diplomacy. And for young students, and some of you just came to Hong Kong U, there are a few platforms at Hong Kong U and also in Hong Kong for you to obviously learn about what's going on in the world, but also express your views, right? So you don't really have to go to social media, which is kind of polluted with fake news and all the biased information, to participate in these sort of global dialogues, right? They're actually academically grounded, relatively balanced, and I think Brian and I, you may not think so, but Brian and I try to be balanced, although we have said quite a few things that are more positive of certain countries. But this is a platform, and you can create your own student groups to talk about things. Perhaps sometimes it's a bit risky to do it publicly. We'll do it internally, and there have been quite lots of closed-door discussions that Brian and I have joined, and we have done our job, and also make Hong Kong to be relevant as not only just a super connector, but actually a platform for track 2 or even track 3, 2.5, 1.5 diplomacies, whatever it is called. But last but not least, we wrote this book, well, I should say we edited this book together with a lot of contributors because we want to learn about what BRICS Plus really are. Because we did some literature review and realized that there has been quite a big vacuum about these 5, now 10 countries. Whether it is relevant or not, there should be some exploratory work for us to start thinking about this group, and more broadly, the future of the Global South or the future of the US-China relation, as well as how we as individuals and just citizens of different countries and cities should navigate this changing landscape. And hopefully, if you feel that you are a global citizen, contribute to the debate and trying to build a better world for everyone. So that's my very general, almost like deep-seek conclusion of today's book talk.
Bravo.
Great. Thank you very much.